right, good morning, everybody. How are we doing? Good. Well, I have the privilege this morning to introduce our workshop leader and very knowledgeable, cool person, I think. So you guys are in for a treat. Pete Harrison is Director of Desegregate. Do CT or Connecticut?
Say Connecticut.
Okay, all right. Desegregate Connecticut. I know you have a cool acronym for that. He's got over a decade of experience in housing policy and tenant organizing. Before Desegregate Connecticut, he was the Senior Housing Policy Advisor at Data for Progress. You may have heard of them. They're a progressive think tank that works on a lot of issues, including housing. When he was there, he co-authored the Homes for All report, which I encourage all of you to Google. It should pop up pretty easily. It's a really great report, worth a read. In addition to helping produce that, he advised on presidential campaigns recently for who became Vice President Harris, Senator Sanders and Warren, and former HUD Secretary Castro. Before that, he previously researched housing and climate policy at the Buell Center at Columbia University. And in another life, he's done a lot recently. He co-founded 2 startups and is on faculty at City University of New York, teaching about tech strategy. Anything else that I missed?
No, I appreciate that.
Okay, cool. Pete, I will hand it over to you. Thank you so much. Oh, and then a couple things of housekeeping. This is being recorded, so if you have people that are interested in this and couldn't be here today, we will have the video of it if I click the right buttons. And if you are here for AIA credit, there's a clipboard up here for you to just sign in. I'll put that over by the door over here. So, Pete, all yours. Appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. Good morning, everybody. Just want to thank Housing for Virginia for the invite. Really fun to be here and getting to talk to some of you over the last day and a half or so. Just before I get started, actually, I want to take a quick poll. I have a kind of request for everybody. My wife and I are down here with our 8-week-old baby, which was ill-advised, but we're here. And we're driving back up today, but I am a huge, huge history nerd, and this is obviously like the history triangle. So I know it's raining, I got an 8-week-old baby, we're really gonna drive by somewhere, but between Jamestown or Yorktown, I'd love to like get a hand to say which one under those extremely uncomfortable circumstances. But if you suggest me to drive by and take a picture of myself somewhere, raise your hand. You think I should do Jamestown? A couple on Jamestown? Okay, and then on Yorktown. Okay, more on Yorktown. Okay, appreciate that. I'll follow up afterwards as to why. But I'm just trying to sell my wife at all of like, no, we should stop out of the way on a feeding cycle to like take a picture or something. Sorry. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. And my workshop was ostensibly about transit-oriented communities and some of the process that we've done at Desegregate Connecticut, but it's really a lens for a much broader conversation of the kind of pro-homes movement that we're sort of all part of. Hoping this all works. So again, my name is Pete Harrison. I'm the Director of Desegregate Connecticut, currently based in New York City, where I've been the last 16 years. Grew up in Connecticut, moving back up there in August. Been with Desegregate Connecticut for about a year, kind of doing remote because of COVID. Currently having a really hard time finding housing in Connecticut, whether it's rental or eventually trying to buy something. So this is something that I'm personally living right now that sort of helps inform some of my work, but certainly makes the crisis very real. So the agenda for today, I'll give an introduction about what DesegregateCT, Desegregate Connecticut, is about, what we're working on, why I think our work is relevant for a lot of the folks in this room. I'll talk about the current zoning barriers in Connecticut, which should sound very familiar to folks in Virginia. Our brand at Desegregate Connecticut is being what I call scrappy nerds. We are very data-driven, and I'll talk about the zoning atlas that we put together that we're sort of slowly evangelizing across the country for other states. So we'll dip into that a little bit. But we also will talk about some of the advocacy work that we do. Specifically, I'll talk about our most recent legislative effort to get a transit-oriented community bill passed, which did not, spoiler alert, but we will get back next year on that. We'll talk about that process and some of the broader themes that I think are relevant for work that we're doing in other parts of the country. We'll go through a specific case study of transit-oriented community advocacy at the local level that we have found to be very successful. Again, it's, some parts of Virginia I think are very relevant, frankly, doing a better job with TOC development than Connecticut is. But broadly, the tactics of talking about some of these issues, I think, is why the case study will be really relevant. And at the end, I want to have questions and comments, but I also want to encourage folks. I teach at the City University of New York. I'm a professor. I don't want to sit up here and lecture. If people have questions or comments or anything during the presentation, please feel free to raise a hand or jump in. So I don't want to necessarily put everything at the end there, but feel free to engage. So Desegregate Connecticut, we are a pro-homes coalition of neighborhood groups and nonprofit groups. Last count around 80, from a range of folks that are in the housing space, supportive services of developers, to literally just some 6-year-old women, anti-racism groups in suburban rural towns of Connecticut, an entire range geographically, demographically. I'll go back to why we call ourselves pro-homes a little bit, but that's going to be one of the themes in terms of the language and words that we use in this conversation. But primarily our work is dedicated to a more equitable and sustainable Connecticut through advocacy of land use reform. Very quick history about us. We started in the summer of 2020. Sarah Bronin, who's sort of a prominent architect and planner, professor at UConn, started this organization. Her husband's the mayor of Hartford. We're kind of a power couple in Connecticut. And she saw this movement within Connecticut for the need for zoning reform. Particularly, this is the 2-year anniversary of the George Floyd murder. That was a galvanizing moment for our coalition, as a lot of folks that were not galvanized for racial justice to begin with became so. And obviously the sweep of protests around the country were a galvanizing effort. But drawing that energy into what I think most of you recognize as somewhat of a wonky, archaic process of land use reform and planning and zoning commission. So Desegregate Connecticut was really, how do you bridge that enthusiasm, get that energy focus at the local and state level, because our land use policies, of course, are deeply part of why Connecticut certainly, but a lot of the country is racially and economically so segregated. So we came together summer 2020, just scrappy nerds trying to put together this first zoning atlas of its kind, which I'll go into. And really trying to visualize and put data onto some of these problems and to really show what the stark problem of land use policy, why it's so deeply related to segregation. And we had really, I think, a lot of success. We passed the first big state level zoning reform in 30 years in Connecticut in 2021. The headline for that was legalizing accessory dwelling units across the state as of right, reducing some parking mandates. That was just an unprecedented effort that I think we benefited, frankly, from a lot of young people being home during COVID and being engaged. So how do you build that momentum going forward? We also do a lot of local effort, organizing, training planning and zoning commissioners, getting folks to run for planning and zoning commissions, getting folks to feel comfortable speaking at these forums, writing op-eds, doing research based on this kind of work. So this is a little hodgepodge of our coalition, which I've talked about, but the one thing I want to highlight here is a lot of these issues, and I'm sure folks run into this all the time, they tend to be siloed when you're talking to legislators. There are the environmental people, there are the housing people, there are the transportation people. What we are trying to do is get those conversations together. We all know these intersectional issues, so we've been really proud, particularly in the last year when I came on, to get a number of climate groups involved in our coalition. Some of these folks are preservationists with really good intent that don't necessarily get the fact that we need smart infill development. They're sometimes on the other side of these issues. We've done a huge outreach effort to get a number of climate groups. Save the Sound is a big group in Connecticut, Sierra Club, groups that in other states kind of oppose some of these kinds of laws. We've actually done a really good job of bringing them in and getting them advocating with their expertise on these issues as well. Desegregated Connecticut is a program of the Regional Plan Association. It's, I think, the oldest planning organization in the country. We just celebrated our centennial this year. It's New York based, but it works in New Jersey, and Connecticut has been for all 100 years. We started out with them just being our fiscal sponsor. We were able to put some funding together and bring on. We thought, because we are an intersectional issue, I thought it was really important to have this kind of transportation infrastructure lens as well. Oftentimes, a lot of the pushback we get good faith or bad faith is the infrastructure around housing development. So being housed in the ERP is a really effective tool for the research side for us. The primary work that we do, one is research. We do a lot of original research on Connecticut-specific zoning laws and the impacts of those policies. I've already mentioned the zoning atlas. We'll take a look at that later. Second is education, turning these data points into materials that folks without this kind of background can digest and be empowered and confident speaking about locally or at the state level. We do briefs on the economic case for zoning reform, the racial justice case, the environmental case. We do specific issue briefs on certain aspects of zoning laws that are sort of archaic, including transit-oriented communities. And then finally, most importantly, we are an advocacy group. This is a political project, as I'll talk a lot about today. And that's really a lot of my background outside of the research. I've done a lot of political engagement work, both at the municipal level in New York and the federal level, as mentioned in the introduction. But this is ultimately uncomfortable territory for a lot of planners and developers background engaging politically, but that is the inevitable part of this process that we very much lean into. I come from a world where I got radicalized by housing from a big bad private equity firm, bought up my apartment, tried to evict me, I had to go down to housing court a bunch of times. So nobody will fight for your home better than you will. We try to empower folks locally to do so. So getting folks on planning and zoning commissions, getting folks worried about primaries at the state level if they're not good on housing issues, all these things are part of the secret sauce, well not so secret sauce, of trying to get a pro-homes agenda passed. And really we have a kind of what I call in Irish Catholic, a holy trinity of issues. It's the economic, environmental, and racial equity aspects of this. So we try to have research, education, advocacy tools spear across those lenses, certainly intersectionally, but independently. People come into this issue space with very different backgrounds and motivations that we certainly learned from the George Floyd uprising. So we try to have research tailored to those kinds of issue groups in our coalition to say, here, your environmental group, here's why you should care about this. Your racial justice group, here you care about this. Just want to give a quick background about Connecticut demographically. I think it's relatively representative of the U.S. It's a little bit whiter. It's about 65% white only, 11% black, 5% Asian, and I believe up to 17% Hispanic of some origin. The interesting or damning part about Connecticut is the racial segregation. You can see here the, I guess, I don't know my colors here, but the majority of Connecticut, whatever blue version that is white majority. You see small pockets around our city. 70% of the residents of color in Connecticut live in just 15 communities, and really just 5 of the major cities. Hartford, New Haven, Bridgeport, Stamford, Waterbury, a little bit of New Britain. Connecticut is, by whatever measure, one of the most racially segregated states. And that's saying something because every state's segregating in many ways back from 50 years ago. I'm sure that's the case in Virginia. So just to want to give you some context, because when we talk about when somewhat friendly legislators say, well, I want to build more in the cities, there's a bit of code behind that, of course, as I think we would all expect. But primarily, it is suburban in nature, but there are pockets of cities and pockets of very rural areas, probably not quite the same breakdown as Virginia as I'm learning, but that's, I think, some context to understand. So I wanted to talk quickly about the zoning atlas. This is really, I think, the value add that we created in this broader movement early on. When Sarah Broden started this, you've got to start somewhere to give people context. So we got some grant money with CT Data Haven, which is a group down in New Haven, to build out this zoning atlas. And over the course of 6 months, pulling from every zoning district. So in Connecticut, there are no county governments. It's 169 cities and towns, which has even more than that in terms of zoning districts. So we pulled all this data together, codified it, and threw it up on this atlas, which is up on our website. It's a really cool resource. We're already working with a number of states and the Urban Institute to pull this out in other places. More or less what we try to visualize here, and I'll pull it up back in the presentation. We can sit on this for a little bit, sorry, appreciate the support. is just a basic land use policy at the town level. If it's commercial, industrial, residential, if it is as of right for single family housing, as of right for multifamily housing, we map out public lands, parks, transit areas, and some water infrastructure, sewer lines, and elsewhere. And that was effectively it to start out with. We have some other projects coming up where we'll map some things like schools and other areas where we want more housing to be around eventually. But just through this, you can go back to the presentation, appreciate it. Just through this visualization, we were able to really start telling this story about land use in Connecticut and drawing it into why Connecticut is so economically and racially segregated. This is not a news flash to anybody in this room, anybody paying attention, even casual observers of the housing crisis now, but Connecticut, like every other state, does have a housing crisis, both from home ownership and also home renters. There is just a dearth of housing. Really, Connecticut got slammed pretty hard during the Great Recession. It's not really recovered. So it's uniquely behind in terms of housing permits compared to some other states. But overall, nearly 40% of residents in Connecticut, households in Connecticut, are cost burden. We show this at places, and I just try to pause and tell legislators, that's crazy. That is a crazy amount of people spending a crazy amount of their household income just to have a roof over their heads. We're not talking about homelessness. We're not talking about supportive services, which is its own crisis in Connecticut like elsewhere. We're talking about people that are doubling up, foregoing medications. You add in 20% of transportation costs, that's 50% of the household is going to just a car and a house to try to get by. That is absolutely insane. So that's, part of, now again, preaching to the choir in this room, but just trying to get people that typically in this space, as you know, tend to be more comfortable, that there are planning and zoning commissions or show up at these meetings. They're not experiencing this crisis. Maybe some elderly folks are retiring, trying to downsize and stay in their communities. Maybe your kids can't afford to live in town, or your grandkids. It's so bad it's starting to percolate into this sphere a little bit, but most people just do not see that in the political conversation. Those 40% of people, as we know, are working jobs, taking care of their parents, taking care of kids. They're not showing up to these kinds of meetings. We are third from the bottom in terms of housing permits. As I mentioned, Illinois and Rhode Island are worse than us. We, again, got knocked out pretty bad in the Great Recession, so already COVID has kind of crazed the housing market in every place, but Connecticut is particularly bad because there's a vast shortage of about 86,000 homes just for low and extremely low income, which percolates to other types of income levels. Partly, the housing crisis is also because we have a planning crisis, as I like to say, in Connecticut. There are 169 towns and cities doing 169 different things. Well, most of them are doing one thing, which is not allowing multifamily housing. But they're all on their own sort of fiefdoms, and it makes it really hard to get out of that mindset, that old kind of Yankee mindset of small town meeting approach. We know the best for our community. If you're not showing up, you're not part of the conversation. So part of our process here is really to kind of try to change that narrative, which I'll go into. So I pulled out just some visualizations of the zoning atlas to demonstrate this issue and how we tell this story. So 81% of residential land across these 169 communities requires almost an acre of land to build a single-family housing. 90% of Connecticut allows single-family housing as of right. Conversely, only about 2% of Connecticut's residential land allows multifamily as of right. Some of these pockets are in the cities. Some of them are just kind of strange artifacts, but primarily that dichotomy of 81% of residential land requires a single-family house on at least an acre of land is a lot of why we are here at the crisis that we are currently. Of course, it has an immensely racialized past that we try to talk about. But again, that contrast is a really good place for us to start. That's why the zoning atlas is such a great tool for storytelling. You can't really hide from that visualization. Oops, I think I just lost this. I don't know if the battery just died. Or did you get something? Okay. But anyway, that visualization is, oh, go ahead.
Hey, I'm so sorry. maybe this is a planning term, but I just don't know, what does as of right mean?
Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, no worries.
That is actually a pretty big topic in our organizing effort. But just quickly, as of right means a community has designated a certain type of structure you can build without getting a special permit from a council or a planning and zoning commission. You have certain requirements that you have to make from a safety sign off, environmental sign off, or whatever. But if you buy an acre of land in 80% of Connecticut, you want to build a single family house, you can do it. Once you just get the sort of permits for whatever stuff, you don't have to go and get approval for it. Whereas everything else, the single family, if you want to build even a townhouse with 2 units, you have to get in front of the planning and zoning commission. They have to approve your permit or not. In some cases, they don't even have that process of special permitting. They just don't allow it at all. So as of right is a sort of de facto, like, if you own the land, you can develop the land based on these parameters. And in Connecticut, that as of right is incredibly limited just to single family housing.
Thank you. That
But
was,
yeah, I appreciate that. And I don't know folks' context, so that's really helpful. But you'll see it, the theme of this conversation talk a lot about that as of right, because we get hit for being this kind of radical agenda trying to destroy zoning and bring as of right to multi-family housing. And we tell legislators like 90% of Connecticut already has as of right planning. This is not a new foreign concept. It's just a different type of housing. So yeah, appreciate you bringing up that concept.
And see, I think one other thing that's important is not just the extra process when you're not by right, but the fact that now the public gets to have a say, right? Because you have this public hearing that's required if there's a special use permit or a rezoning that has to happen. And that's kind of more of an issue sometimes than just the rigmarole of actually going through the special use permit.
Yeah, so when it's, okay, I want to develop a 6-unit affordable housing development in my town, it gets in front of the public hearing, so it's not just the commissioners, it's the public who come and speak. And how many people can show up at 7 o'clock in the basement of City Hall in a meeting? It tends to be older, whiter, wealthier population. Undoubtedly a minority of opinion in a given community, undoubtedly. But it's outsized voice of folks who can show up to these meetings to protest that. And that's kind of the problem that we're in a lot of cases. And that's very true in just about every state, so it's not certainly unique to Connecticut.
And the key point is your project could get denied, never be allowed to occur.
Yes. Yeah, and it's oftentimes you'll see it where town, planning and zoning rejects, housing development, citing traffic, citing character of the community, whatever that might be. Connecticut has a provision passed in the 1990 law called 830G that effectively gives a builder's remedy to this as of right issue. So if, for example, you come into Fairfield and want to have a 10-unit apartment building and 30% of those are deed restricted affordable housing, if the Planning and Zoning Commission rejects your proposal, which 100% of the time they will, the builder can actually apply for this 830G exemption to say because we need this 30% affordability and the town does not have 10% deed restricted affordable, we can override that planning and zoning decision and continue. That is a nuclear through rail in Connecticut politics, as you would imagine, and that has been, there's some flaws within that process. Certainly it was one of many things that was supposed to be done 30 years ago, including a lot of the zoning stuff we're talking about now. But that has been the one avenue for builders within this program to kind of get around that, but it's just totally nuclear, which we'll talk about. This is partly explained why Connecticut is not growing. The most recent census, it grew by 0.9%, which is third lowest in the country. We are shedding young people. We had a 10% drop in school-age children in Connecticut. It's aging. We're also losing the elderly. So demographically, it's in kind of a death spiral, to be honest. And I say that in front of Connecticut people too. Like, this is just not sustainable, the kind of trajectory that we're going on. A lot of it is this restrictive land use policy. So the pro-homes movement is really as much a policy project as it is a political project. And we want to create what we term as this all-of-the-above approach. We use pro-homes specifically because I cringe every time I hear units, housing, whatever the kind of real estate term. Like, the audience that we all need to speak to are that 50% of people in a community that kind of don't know about this stuff. that probably want to see more kinds of development. That 25% NIMBY group, when we talked about this morning, you're never going to reach them. Never going to convert them. You just have to out hustle and out organize them. So you got to get your 25% out, but you've got to speak to that 50% that very casually hears about this stuff. So we don't talk about housing, we don't talk about units, we talk about homes. We also don't just talk about in terms of home ownership, we talk about home renters. Elevating the idea that even if you don't own a home, you still live in a home, so you're not a tenant, you're not a renter, you are a home renter. That is, again, trying to give more agency and political relevancy to a group that is sort of ignored, certainly at the local level politically, but elsewhere. So we are very, this comes back from some of my data for progress era of trying to change how we talk about housing and all this kind of real estate or nonprofit development kind of language to get to that 50% audience that really wants more homes in their community for themselves, for their children, or for the people that work in their lives. So that kind of gets to what we've done at the state level. So we do local organizing and state level work. And given the fact that we are trying to have this all-the-above approach, that you need folks at the planning and zoning commissions that know what they're talking about and want to grow homes agenda, you need state officials, and eventually you need the federal government as well. We have a proposal, three-pronged proposal last year. We tried to target, and I don't, to be honest, didn't think we needed success in this session, but because we have urban communities, suburban communities, and rural communities, we try to target legislation that has something for each of those things. And there can be really hard to try to find those audiences. In the 2021 state legislature, on the backs of George Floyd uprising, on the backs of COVID, a ton of people came out for zoning reform. That's not always going to be the case. So you've got to have issues that speak to each community individually and respectfully. So we had our primary one, which was to build more homes near our transit stations, which I'll get into a lot. We had a second one, creating minimum lot sizes. As I mentioned, 80% of Connecticut has a requirement of just about an acre. Vermont just passed a reduction of that. I think it's 1/8 of an acre as of right development. So if I own an acre of land in Connecticut, I can't do anything but develop a single family house on it. If we pass this proposal, I could carve that up and build smaller townhomes or something like that. And then the third one was to reduce zoning bureaucracy, is kind of the way we phrased it, but effectively trying to overcome this barrier that 169 towns have their own planning and zoning commissions, their wetlands commissions, their environmental review commissions, their water districts, and trying to voluntarily allow, particularly rural communities that can't get enough volunteers for these positions, to start consolidating some of these processes. It's a little bit of a beachhead to the idea of regionalization that we're slowly trying to reduce in Connecticut. But we heard from a lot of our allies in rural communities that they don't have people to fill a lot of these positions. So let's try to simplify it for developers, let's simplify it for folks in the town by allowing voluntarily these towns to consolidate. Because of the individual charters of these towns, you actually have to have a pretty big regulatory process to do so. So that was what we brought into this 2022 session. In the Connecticut legislature, it's a 2-year cycle. The election year, even year number, is a short session. It only is 80 days comparatively to 6 months. It's an election year. We are in a reactionary period nationally without anything to do with anything progressive or even sort of moderate. So in that cycle, we dropped the lot size and bureaucracy pretty quickly. There wasn't much juice for that. We focused on the transit-oriented community part of that process. So partly we did this because we think it's what's next in Connecticut from an infrastructure standpoint. And partly we did this too because it's also a better lens to have this conversation about this all-of-the-above approach. The fact that Connecticut has 200 years of train lines, primarily oriented at getting folks from Fairfield County in the southern part of Connecticut into Grand Central. That's been sort of the orientation for the last 60 years or so. But there are other lines in other parts of the state which we can do. I'll show you on the map in a short bit here. But we thought this is a really great issue to have a local focus of building more homes around this existing infrastructure, but also to say, because taxpayers across the state have put in infrastructure money to improve these lines, to create some other expanded commuter lines, the Hartford line connecting Springfield, Massachusetts through Hartford down to New Haven opened up a few years ago. Millions and millions of dollars of state money before even the federal infrastructure bill has come on has been put into improving the transportation system in Connecticut, frankly reestablishing it that had been much better. So the obvious next thing is towns need to zone for more homes around the stations. It's not good enough to have a state-owned parking lot, a service parking lot, that obviously during COVID is not being used at all. Something like 40 million annual trips on the New Haven line from New Haven to Grand Central, white-collar 9-to-5 jobs in finance, that's not coming back after COVID. We all know that. There's a huge crisis of funding for public transportation systems, commuter systems. But so much of the conversation and imagination legislators have, the state level and local level, is, well, you don't need infrastructure because we don't have all these people commuting to white-collar jobs. The image for us is actually we have tons of people that could use this system if they live close to a job. Intra-city, intra-Connecticut commuters to get out of cars and to have the ability to live near a train station is a logical extension. So part of it was it's good policy, it's something that kind of exists in the popular imagination to some degree, but otherwise it is a political agenda to get more support for state level interventions in land use. So that's really why we targeted it. So to promote this in Connecticut, we went back to the original 3 things that we do. It's research, education, advocacy. Using our zoning atlas, we gathered all of the existing transit stations, and that means fixed stations. So a train station, or there's a single rapid bus line between New Britain and Hartford. So not a local bus in this sense, just a fixed transit station. There are 40 towns in Connecticut that have at least one transit station, highlighted here. Again, this is Fairfield County. This is New Haven where the east line ends. There's a shoreline. If anyone's ever taken to Casella, there's a local east shoreline that goes through these suburban towns. The Hartford line comes up through here. There are a couple of gaps that are coming online. There's a small Waterbury branch here and a Danbury branch here. These branches have very limited service. The Hartford line has, I think, 12 trips a day. East Shore line is also fairly limited. So it's important for us talking about the context, not just of the land use, but also the ridership. Because the obvious thing we'll say, like, you know, these kind of rural towns in the East Shore are very exclusionary, do not allow anything. If we're trying to make the case, again, for everyone's imagination of, well, nobody that lives in Guilford, Connecticut commutes to New York City, so why do we need to have more housing along Shoreline East? The ridership is not as much as the New Haven line. We're very mindful of that, and again, it's a deeper conversation of getting people out of cars within interstate steps. So we have 51 train stations, 10 of these CT Fast Track, this rapid bus line, and one in Hartford that's a multiple for both of those. There are some discussions of expanding these rapid bus lines in some other areas. The Fast Track in New Britain is very unique. It's an old rail freight line, so it's actually a divided, separate line. So it's not something like a bus lane that's being painted on the actual surface road. It's a separate ease of way. But that's the landscape of what kind of exists in Connecticut. So we put together, based on this zoning atlas, all the zoning patterns around these 40 towns. I'll go through this very quickly, but not surprisingly, most of them, particularly the ones in the suburban communities, make it very difficult to build housing of any kind, let alone multifamily housing, within this kind of classic half-mile radius of the station. That's about a 10-minute walk. You know, typically what most people experience as a walkable distance. So that was our target of within the half-mile radius of these stations, what's the existing land use patterns. Most of them do not allow small lot sizes, multifamily housing as of right. It's either not zoned for residential at all. A lot of these rails were built in kind of the industrial area of Connecticut in the 19th century. So there's a lot of complicating facts that are sort of historic there as well. But certainly a number of towns do not allow any multifamily. All these are kind of the 15 bad towns. Berlin is one that I'll pull out as a caveat, which we'll talk about in the case study. But effectively, we try to tell a story of there's an immense amount of public revenue that's gone into this infrastructure system. It's good for the environment, it's good for all these things about getting people out of cars. But these individual towns that are benefiting from having a state-level revenue, the public taxpayer money, are not doing their smart shoulder repair to build housing within these stations. So we had a couple other data points I'll go through very quickly here. Some about residential lot sizes and some other things. Effectively, we created 40 different one-pages for each of the transit towns to go through what the land use is. Again, we did this for state legislators representing these communities, we did it for planning and zoning commissions, council members, and primarily for local residents to say, go and speak at a planning and zoning meeting about this issue. Here are some resources you can capture from us to give you the education, the vernacular to talk about this work. Then we turned to education. So we did a couple of really interesting things. I think this is the video. We won't play the video in the interest of time, but we got a little bit of grant money from the Hartford Foundation to put together a really cool explainer video, animated explainer video for transit-oriented communities. We had a local voiceover artist. We promoted this on social media, particularly on Facebook, which gets to kind of that boomer, older sort of homeowner audience. We did a number of these transit-oriented community walk audits, which I'll spend time on the case study of actually physically getting into these communities with stations, getting people in the communities, excuse me, to walk around, to see what the land use patterns look like at the street level. AARP does these great walk audits. I don't know if folks are familiar with them, that are based kind of on pedestrian, like bike safety, street crossings, that kind of infrastructure. So we modeled it under those and pulled out some specific items to track in terms of land use pattern. Are there apartment buildings? Are there condos? Are there townhouses? Are there industrial sites that are underutilized? Are there other empty lots? Is that residential? Is that commercial? Is that state-owned? Whatever that might be. So we did a lot of outreach. We actually hired an organizer just to do these walk audits in Connecticut over the summer. They've been really effective tools. We'll go through a case study in Berlin. But finally, we developed our legislative proposal. As I mentioned, the three issues that we brought in, we quickly focused on our TOC proposal. We modeled ours under what passed just the year before in Massachusetts. The MBTA, sort of the greater Boston area commuter rail line, they got, as I learned more by the sheer grace of God, an actual TOC bill passed, technically bipartisan because Charlie Baker is a Republican governor and he signed it at the last minute. But we based it basically on that same premise, that rather than try to have a huge amount of zoning, trying to be mindful that some of these transit stations are in cities, some of them are in suburban areas. Literally, some of them are, give or take the New Haven lineup, in some of the wealthy communities in Fairfield, it's literally like a tiny 19th century station with a tiny little parking lot, and there's like a $4 million mansion across the street. There's a huge spectrum of different experiences for this infrastructure. So we tried to have a baseline that would be acceptable for a smaller amount of density that towns or cities that wanted to do more could. We landed at 15 homes per acre, which is again what was in Massachusetts. We had a 10% affordability requirement there. Massachusetts did not actually have any affordability requirement. Again, half-mile radius as we talked about. No onerous parking requirements. We try to get none in at all. That's always going to be a contention in suburban Connecticut where the cars are going to be parked. Common sense exceptions for environmentally sensitive lands. Anything that is sort of sensitive. A question?
What is the affordability requirement?
It's based on, I forget what the AMI was. It was not robust. And there was a big internal conversation with our coalition of, do we want to have nothing from an affordability standpoint, which seemed to be partly why Massachusetts was passed, or do we want to try to have a 30%? Where's the sort of feedback on that? A lot of the developers in our coalition we talked to, even they were kind of split, saying like, well, politically it might be easier not to do it. This 830G thing exists, and maybe we can work on that. We got hammered on that 10% on both sides. That it wasn't enough for some housing advocates, that it was too much for sort of anti-homeless individuals. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but I forgot what the level was. I don't think we specified in the legislation. This was a little bit of like, once you get into the sausage making, we'll kind of see how that goes. My hope was that we would have gotten into the committee process and maybe gotten that up to 30%, some different incentives and some other sort of bonuses, but I'll explain why we didn't get there. One of the key elements about this was also the idea of local control. That's a term along with as of right that we'll talk about today. The idea that this is a state mandate superseding local planning and zoning commissions that know their towns better. We were very mindful of that. So within this guise, this is still up to planning and zoning commissions at the local level to determine what part of this half-mile radius would actually be developed. You could do, a quarter of a mile development within a range that could be, 60 homes per unit instead of the 75% on the other side. There was a lot of intentional discretion at the Planning and Zoning Commission level to get that buy-in from the local P&Zs to say, okay, the state law passed, now we have to figure out how to comply with that. We don't want to do the entire half-mile radius, we'll focus just on the central business district right on the north part of the station, and we'll get to a 60 homes per acre, which would be satisfied by a couple of buildings, 5/1s or something. So we put together, if that half-mile radius, say it's only 25%, is actually upzoned because of environmental concerns and existing infrastructure, et cetera. We put together just some rough numbers of, we're talking about 116,000 homes, 10% affordable with more than, I think, double what Connecticut has in de-restriction housing. So that was just kind of the, cocktail napkin numbers to talk about this, but the political purpose of this was to say, we don't expect that full half-mile radius to be zoned, we expect the local Planning and Zoning Commission to have that insight into where we want them. As long as that baseline 15 homes per acre is satisfied across all of them, that can be satisfied. We also conceded pretty early on that towns that have multiple stations can focus just on one station. That was a little bit of a political concession. Again, that little 19th century station across the street from $4 million mansion shouldn't be exempt. But politically we thought it would make more sense just to get folks more excited about central business districts in some of these towns. So that's kind of what we went into in the session. Our strategy was focusing just on the transit-oriented community aspect of it from an education and research standpoint, trying to keep the issue as low temperature as possible, highlighting the fact that this was a bipartisan bill passed in Massachusetts. Everybody, New England cares about whether New England states are doing only fall behind, particularly the governors. So we tried to also make it just a low-hanging fruit, simple, non-radical thing to keep it from being a talker, which means if it's controversial and somebody on one side wants to talk it to death, the process is just so short in a short session. Even if the policy is popular, it can be killed. The policy focus was to demonstrate that TOCs, we picked that term instead of transit-oriented development. We wanted to highlight the community side of this, that this is not just about encouraging development for development's sake. This is getting back to the 19th century transit-oriented communities that Connecticut was built along. We really highlighted that in many cases this is getting back to the classic New England character, not something radical departure. A radical departure is cars and highways. Actually getting back to Connecticut being an industrial state in the 19th century built around the rail, canals and rivers. They're all walkable, transit-oriented. Emphasize local control. We knew we had to get ahead of that as a talking point to say the Planning and Zoning Commissions still have discretion over what is actually going to get rezoned here to satisfy this. And finally, visualizing what 15 homes per acre looks like. Everybody thinks it's going to be skyscrapers. The sort of anti-homes coalition folks that I'll talk about were really good about trying to fulfill this imagination of, we don't want to be like Manhattan, we don't even want to be like New Rochelle, which is a community in Westchester County that's building tall buildings. So we had some of our architecture interns put up some of these different models. This could be an apartment building with some parkland, some playgrounds. Here's a combination of duplexes, ADUs, townhouses, etc. So we tried to fill that vacuum of imagination, pump that out on social media, pump that out on our one-pagers, our emails, our legislative breakfasts, visualize as much as we could about what this looks like in the scale that is actually fairly common in parts of Connecticut historically already. We also highlighted the bipartisan nature of this. Connecticut is supermajorities of Democrats, which means there's a tiny fraction of very progressive Democrats, a broader scope of moderate Democrats, and then some Republicans. And there's some Republicans that see the conservative argument about property rights and development, attracting jobs and job creators. But what we really wanted to highlight is get this out of it being a partisan lens. I think most people knows that this is not a partisan issue, strictly speaking. I think it's becoming that, certainly, and it has been somewhat at a national level, which we'll talk about. But our strategy was to say, this is bipartisan, this is something that's smart for businesses, for homeowners, for home renters, et cetera, and highlight Charlie Baker passing this. That was a lot of our messaging. So, the step one in a short session is you've got to get a committee chair in the state legislature to actually raise your bill, which is, again, another hurdle that's not the case in a long session in an odd year. So we were able to get a champion in the planning and zoning. They have joint commissions between the Senate and the Assembly, in Connecticut. So we got our bill raised, we got a number, more or less the language we proposed was what was in it. And then the next thing is actually getting on the agenda for a public hearing. We were really hoping, again, to not be a talker or controversial, to have like a nice, breezy, like 4-hour public hearing, a little bit on both sides, whatever, but like sail through to get to a floor vote. Unfortunately, that did not happen. There is a small but mighty anti-homes group in Connecticut, homeowners just in Fairfield County, that throw a lot of money at Facebook ads and other types of op-eds and things to sort of, say the sky is falling, whatever. So very quickly that hearing turned into a 15-hour slog. I was grilled for about 2 hours. I was accused of being a real estate shill, which, I'm like certainly pro-development, that's fine, but I have like socialist tenant organizers as a background, so that was mind-blowing. I thought they were going to hit me for that. No, that was not what they hit me for. But we ran into a number of these kinds of arguments, which gets to a little bit of your point. Local control is good. Of course, a community that's on the ground knows what's best for the community versus a one-size-fits-all approach. As much as we try to highlight the fact that even within this bill, the local planning and zoning has authority over how to dictate that, the narrative very quickly turned. This is a state mandate, and towns know better than the state and these real estate interests. So a one-size-fits-all approach is not what's good for Connecticut, which in some cases is obviously just a bad faith. We don't want to get anything done around Manhattan. Real estate front, yes, affordable housing, no overdevelopment. That's a sign that they've sent into a lot of places in Fairfield County. That was that's an awful mind bender of how you say yes to affordable housing without overdevelopment. You got hit from that 10% not being affordable enough. The folks that were against any kind of development going in at all are now saying it's not affordable enough. This is bad for the environment. That was something, honestly, naively I didn't anticipate, but somebody actually, one of their members wrote op-eds across the state saying it's bad to have this kind of development. We shouldn't have development along the shore if there's going to be climate change in 30 years. Mind you, these are people that oppose some environmental bills that were being proposed in Connecticut at the time as well. But we were not expecting to actually get hit as being infill development being bad for the environment, which of course intuitively know it's good for the environment. So even though we had research talking points for that, the narrative around this really came out. Work harder to live here. That's the huge part of the narrative in Fairfield County. I made it. I worked really hard, even though my parents are rich, and I work in finance in Manhattan. But you should work harder. That's the closest it got to fairy dogma. So there were some pretty racist comments about affordable housing, the euphemisms of what that means. But that's a mentality that the audience, that 50% audience that we're trying to get to, remember I said at the beginning of this, that's what we're trying to get to. And these are incredibly effective messaging tools. So even though this is a very small group of exclusively homeowners, we're talking like $5 million homes for most of these folks. Not a statewide group, but just a small amount. But these kinds of ideas of local control as a good thing, that's an ideological argument that's what we're trying to chip away against. So this is some of they had one rally at a train station that targeted us specifically. There are some great Republicans that really get this issue that were supportive of us, so we would be bipartisan. There are two particularly horrific Republicans in Fairfield County that I had a video we won't play, but it's a woman who was accusing all the young people we had testifying of not having the right to testify because they don't have the lived experience and they should be worried about their careers instead of housing costs in Connecticut. So there's some real bad actors. I frankly think some of the Republicans in Connecticut are kind of like, look. But they're effective and they kind of allow them to get out there and talk about this stuff. I just want to highlight the top left. I just kind of chuckle, you keep planning and zoning decisions local. It's like, by definition, a decision made by the Planning and Zoning Commission is a local decision. So I don't know what you're talking about. But anyway, that's some of the coalition that came out against us. So we also turned out a great diverse coalition for us. These are stats that are probably not as relevant, but these don't typically get a lot of written statements, these kinds of bills. We had 117 supportive, substantive individual coalition group members talking 2-page reviews of all of our research data, why we want to do this, AARP, Connecticut Conference of Municipalities, which is a big sort of advocacy group for town governments. We came correct. We had the broad spectrum of everybody who wants on this coalition speaking in favor of it. Very quickly the narrative became old versus new. This Republican assembly person attacking all the young people, the pro-homes advocates that came out, became a huge news story in Connecticut. We got a couple weeks cycle about how crazy it was that this woman was attacking young people for caring about housing in the state. This is a video of it, which we won't play for the time. But we put together a quick 2-minute review of all these young people, high school kids, college kids, law students, architecture, planning students, whatever, talking about, I grew up in Connecticut, I want to live in Connecticut, but I can't afford to stay here. Why would I come back after college if I can't do that? So that was a very good narrative for us. However, that, hearing went off the rails. 15 hours pretty much means the leadership knows it's going to be a talker, and it's just not going to make it out of committee, so we got killed. As anyone who works in the state legislature, it's a couple of years cycle to get some of this stuff done. We've got some champions. The state legislature, it's easier to get bills raised in a longer session. We're pretty confident we laid good groundwork for getting something done with some caveats, and we'll probably change some of the affordability. We'll go back to our coalition and learn some of the lessons. So I want to talk about some of these lessons that we learned. I think will be valuable for Virginia as well. Number one, and this probably shouldn't be an issue, but it was actually getting the premise to be accepted that we had a housing crisis. Even through 2021, people refused to admit that there was a housing crisis in Connecticut because, again, if you're a homeowner, you're pretty cushy. So that 40% of cost burden individuals politically are not part of the conversation locally at the state level. We got that, and frankly, just because the housing crisis is so bad, that premise is no longer contested. So we didn't have to spend time convincing people to care about this issue. People had to care about this issue. Second, our data made TOCs an acceptable premise. We had just great research about this. It just doesn't make sense that a town doesn't allow multifamily housing around the amount of money put into the state. So that was a premise. Even the opponents would say, yes, to affordable housing, no to more development. We're also, yes, we want transit-oriented communities. They're good, but we want to do it locally, or it shouldn't be everywhere. It shouldn't be a mandate. So the fact that we got that premise accepted that this is something good was very important for us. I already talked about the fact that this was a youth movement. So that contrast of young, new, dynamic, static was really valuable for our narrative. And because our coalition spanned geography, suburban, rural, urban, all parts of the state, issue-oriented based, we had a very coordinated stance in opposition. That 117 pieces of testimony were not enough. There were about 130 pieces of testimony against us submitted, but literally 95% of them were one-word emails saying, I don't want affordable housing in my community. So, the numbers were fairly even. It seemed controversial. Substantively, the issue we're stronger on, we're right about it, we have more support. That bodes well for us in the long run. Things that didn't. The anti-homes messaging reached a bigger audience. There's a systemic bias towards who shows up for these things anyway. That was overcome a little bit because COVID allowed remote hearings to happen, made it easier for people rather than have to get a car or bus up to Hartford to testify. So that helped us. That there's an effort to get back to in-person hearings, both at the local P&Z levels and at the state level, and we're trying to resist with other coalition groups on other issues. But it's still a problem that there's just a natural bias towards people saying no to this stuff. Legislators get 5 times as many calls opposing this kind of work than supporting it. So we've got to do more about getting young people out to those local level. Racial equity completely vanished as an issue. Every legislator in Connecticut, I'm sure other parts of the country, wanted to be right on racial equity, looked like they cared about it, recognized there was a problem systemically in Connecticut and the country. That was a huge propelling force for us getting that law passed in 2021, vanished from the conversation in this year. Our name is deeply polarizing in Connecticut, maybe not surprising. People are like, I love what you guys do, I love it, it's great, but man, that name's tough for me to get behind in my community. Wish you guys would change the name because I love what you're doing. If that's good faith or bad faith, it doesn't matter. It's a very polarizing term. Making white homeowners uncomfortable is a really hard political lift for anybody. We understand that. We're not going to shy away from that. But it became us talking about policy versus talking about the broader issues of affordability and racial equity. We're in a backlash era across the country that we're going to center that issue, but that's still very polarizing in a way that wasn't the case a year ago. This local control as a right conversation was manipulated and sort of misunderstood. People saying, we don't want as of right development in our towns, we don't want as of right. 90% of your town is actually as of right already, just for single family housing. Like one of our allied legislators completely embarrassed a local council member in Greenwich, Connecticut, who was railing against as of right development, and he pointed out using our atlas, but that's already a thing. Like, you just don't want multifamily housing, just completely embarrassed and got a news cycle out of that. So at the same time, those terms, the idea of local control, all these things were complicated. There's not a baseline of public awareness of what this issue is. So we got behind the ball of people saying, well, yeah, local control is good. I guess I don't want the state to do the leading on this. Yeah, I guess as of right does seem scary if it's going to be a skyscraper all of a sudden in my neighborhood. So we identified a lot of the policy work on these terms to educate the public on, to not say that we're against local control, but to say we want certain types of local control plus state control plus federal control. So I said earlier, our term is all of the above. That's our pro-homes catchphrase. We got local, state, and federal. That's all the above approach to solving this crisis. So just a couple of lessons I think to take away. Provide more locally tailored data. One of the things that we wanted to identify, we just didn't have the capacity to, was there is a lot of state-owned land within this half-mile radius of transit stations. We think that's a natural way to build a deeply affordable housing. There was a bill a couple years ago floating around to try to streamline this process for state-owned land that's underutilized to be developed for housing. We want to visualize that in our zoning atlas. It doesn't have that highlighted now. We got some research interns working on that to highlight that. Again, this idea of affordability, you know, the market can do a little bit of that, subsidize, or we can get the state to do more of that with this public land conversion. That's a big part of the cost going forward. Consistently message this idea of pro-homes, vision of local control, as of right, these other zoning terms that are being weaponized against the pro-homes agenda, trying to take back those terms and recognize that they're actually tools that can be used to benefit folks in our community and balance out the character of the community. I've been using the term anti-homes. We keep it pretty simple, pro-homes, anti-homes. Name names. Bad guys are bad guys. Luckily, they're villainous bad guys in some cases. So actually, like getting out there and calling them that, anti-homes, making them against something, putting them on the defensive, is a large part of the political rhetorical process that we do at our session. Organizing more young people as well. We don't apologize when we send young people into a meeting locally that they don't live in the town, because a lot of people that live in a town that can't show up at 7 o'clock in the basement of the city hall, someone's got to show up for them, whether they're working class, they're young kids, whatever it is. A lot of people that can't come to those meetings, so we want to send people out to do that kind of work and get that in those local meetings and those state level meetings. It is a youth movement. A lot of people brain training in Connecticut. I'm one of them. I left Connecticut 16 years ago. I'm moving back now, but we have a huge problem there trying to get those folks that did grow up in Connecticut activated is a really good thing for us politically. And then finally, as I mentioned this, reassessing or reasserting racial justice on pro-homes reforms, getting that language together, particularly as it relates to some of the housing movement in Connecticut. The Connecticut housing movement is relatively factious, just historically groups kind of focusing on different work in different parts of the state. One of the key things that we want to avoid in the pro-homes movement is not to make the argument that people of color should leave the cities and go to these high opportunity, highly resourced communities. That's not a good message, because we want to have resources and good communities in our cities. From an infrastructure standpoint, environmental standpoint, we want infill development in our cities. So we don't want to make the case that the only way to solve this problem is to get people of color into the suburban communities. Suburban communities have to do more work to create more diverse types of housing. But we also need to have more tailored approaches to the cities. We didn't activate a lot of our urban coalition groups as we would have liked to. The TOC bill, only 40 towns and cities out of 169 towns. So we lost rural community support, we lost urban community support that kind of already do this work. So that's a big part of why we want to have a tailored approach that speaks more to racial equity in the context that it needs to be talked about. All right, so I want to talk quickly how we're doing on time here. Okay.
We're good. And if you want to take a break for questions now before we move, feel free to have questions.
So you talk about local champions. or a statewide, you know, those influencers in our communities that can help sell the pro homes movement. Did you do it, or did you think about it, or?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of, so the question was, do we identify local champions? The short answer is yes. There are usually at least one or two, just like, take all the grief from everybody against it, come up and speak to these meetings. It's a numbers game. Oftentimes, even if you have one or two people show up for something like this, we get a lot farther than having 0 people show up in it. We are demonstrably still outnumbered of who shows up to these meetings. So we have a great network, we have a kind of a weekly newsletter, we have coalition meetings, we do training sessions for local folks, how to write an op-ed, speak at a public meeting. Here's how to navigate the zoning resources to understand what your town is doing. In Connecticut, there is a state law passed in 2017 that requires all 169 municipalities to have an affordable housing plan that's due in a couple of weeks. It's the first time. We have a massive local organizing effort over the summer to get people to make a huge stink about these plans. We're going to have guidelines, report cards of what's in the plans, what shouldn't be in the plans. Here's gold standard. Here's a town or city doing a great job. Here's why your town sucks. We're doing a call-in of like, there are towns that are trying their best, and these local housing commissions set up specifically for these plans, want to do the good thing. There's a town in the East Shoreline, eastern part of Connecticut, Stonington, has a transit station. Hired a consultant, had a beautiful 50-page plan, earnest, good effort, here's what we can do, here's the timelines to do it, brought it to a public hearing, all hell broke loose. They rejected the plan, they wrote a scaled-down 5-page plan that has platitudes about looking for ideas and having conversations about affordable housing. Now, how do we have that nuanced conversation of calling out the town by recognizing there's actually champions trying to do the best that got shut down? We piss off so many people all across Connecticut for trying to find this balance. But that's, again, it's 25%, 25%, 50%. I know that there are more people that support Pro Home's agenda. How do we get them out motivated? How do we get those voices balanced out? A lot of state legislators in Connecticut, it's a part-time position. There are also local council members, first selectmen. There are also like a disproportionately high percentage of landlords in the Connecticut legislature. So even talking about home renters is like a thing that makes people uncomfortable in that sense. So there's a lot of structural issues to talk about these issues, to identify local champions. That's why we try to get young people as a new sort of engagement in the audience. But that's a lot of the challenge from an organizing standpoint. And you know, if I didn't highlight it enough, that's not because we're not doing the work for it, but certainly we're at a structural disadvantage revving up to that even keel. You know, even local newspapers or a couple of great local housing reporters that cover this stuff, the nuance that we kind of need to see. There are plenty more that don't. There are plenty more that just equate desegregate Connecticut with this radical, you know, progressive agenda and or real estate developers, state interests that just, you know, make it sound like we're doing something that's not popularly supported. So we do have a lot of local folks involved. How do we get them that next step to get on the planning and zoning commissions, to get elected? That's a longer 3 to 5 year project. But as I kept saying, it's a political process. We cannot engage this issue without getting really shitty people out of office and good people in and making them honest about it. And that's a little bit early days for us in desegregated. That's one of the processes we have.
Yeah, speaking of structural issues, I know that, like, say you all were successful and you still have to rely on local zoning and planning commissions. I mean, one of the things that, I'm not familiar with the way the Connecticut state and local governments are set up, but the composition of planning commissions, I feel like might be something that I don't know if you've looked at in terms of, I know there are some cities and towns in Virginia that you have to be a homeowner you have to own land to be a homeowner to serve on a planning commission, and that might be, your thoughts on that. I mean, obviously, what you just said kind of, I know that the political context isn't necessarily, you know, you can't really acquiesce in that way necessarily, but I don't know if that's something structurally you all looked at to counteract. Imagine if you had this COC bill happen, but then you're dealing still with the same kind of
There's terrible planning commissions.
exactly.
Yeah, and that's a real problem. One way we're looking at it, too, that we know their planning and zoning commissioners are older, whiter, and wealthier owners in the state population. Need to be representative of the town population. But we don't have data on that. We're starting a survey over the summer. It's voluntary. you know, I don't know how many people are going to want to do a DesegregateCT survey demographically, but we're trying to get some data behind actually who's on these commissions that we know intuitively is majority, like heavy majority white. And again, there are nuances to this as well. We lost some progressive groups in our cities for fear of just placement and gentrification. Because in Connecticut there are really only like 2 cities, Stamford and Danbury, that are building homes, there is a disproportionate concentration of development, changing these neighborhoods, raising rents, displacing folks. Obviously there's macro issues behind that. But on the ground, there is this perception of, I don't want more development in Stamford because South development, you know, South side Stamford, there's gentrification happening, displacement. It's complicated, nuanced, but those are reasonable concerns that have to be part of the conversation that we have as well. And again, like we have an all of the above approach, including just cause eviction, all these things that we support. Message that is one challenge, but actually even in certain places where there's good faith commissioners that are just like, man, like I don't know, it just seems like a lot. We try to make the case of if the statewide is doing this, every community is doing this, the pressure will not just fall on 2 or 3 communities. So that's part of the process too. We always try to get it back to that balance of all the above approach. So local planning and zoning commissions, if we get this law passed next year, which we have to be hoping to, a lot of it will be education at the local level to say, here's how to do this, here's how it's going to work. Going back to that 15 homes per acre visualization, and some of the real experiences we have, this case study that we'll talk about shortly, we have examples in Connecticut of this being done locally, proactively, really cool projects that are mixed use, some affordable, some market rate, already leased up, whatever it is. So it's not a foreign concept that we have to sort of imagine for people. We can pull out those examples in Connecticut. But the law that we got passed in 2021 set up a minimum of 4 hours of training for planning and zoning commissioners that had never existed before. There's a couple of things that were on the wonky back end. If you can't use protecting the character of the community as a subtractive way to veto things, you know, having different studies and availability. But we actually will now be one of the people training planning and zoning commissioners going forward. So we have some programming for that too. So part of it is attacking bad people, getting them out of office and putting people in. There's a lot of the call-in type people that I think are open to this stuff that want to do better, that we're reaching as well. But we want to try to get some data behind that to do a better job with it. There's a constant conversation, I'm sure a lot of you have it too. Should we just abolish local control and say, screw you, you dummies, you don't know what you're doing, and do it? I'm still optimistic that we can have good local control as part of this all above approach. That's contested within our coalition. It's contested in the broader movement. But I think it's a better political strategy to try to get good local control as part of our conversation.
How is your coalition managed? How did you create it? How does it help make your decisions? Does it help fund you? Is it something that covers everything that you do, or do you attract supporters for specific things? Just talk to us a little bit more about the mechanics of it. Oh, and are they official members? That's on your website, and it says, you know, be a member. So like, how do you have that organized?
Yeah, great question. So as I said, you know, our coalition is about 80 groups. Some have wide range capacity in affordable housing space for 20 years. Partnership for Strong Communities is one of our anchor coalition members. They've been doing this kind of work research for a very long time. How we've generally done it, when Sarah Bronin started the organization, very ad hoc of getting young people together and reaching out to different groups, talking about racial justice and housing justice. And, hey, do you want to join a coalition? It meant giving us a JPEG of your coalition logo so we could put it up, and joining our kind of like, at the time it was monthly calls, legislative sessions, bi-weekly calls. We didn't require much more from those coalition members. What I'm starting coming in, I come from a deep organizing background. We're putting together a steering committee of like a smaller segment, balance between nonprofit groups and neighborhood groups, to be an advisory standpoint for strategic focus for statewide legislation, for organizing efforts, for more coalition organizing. So we want to formalize the structure just to get a deeper pool of outreach from our coalition members activated, whether it's local stuff or state level stuff. You know, we're trying to model this through the Regional Plan Association, which we're part of, we're trying to create this model in New York and New Jersey as well. So we're actually trying to figure out, what capacity coalition members have to be part of a decision-making process. How do we funnel out the consensus and still not be so consensus-based that we don't take strong stands and move quickly. There are a couple of coalitions in Connecticut that do this kind of work that are consensus-based, that are meaning they don't want to piss off anybody and move quickly. So we want to keep a certain amount of dynamism, aggressive activism. So what we've decided, the steering committee's advisory, outside of the bounds of the usual coalition calls. We have a lot of our young policy fellows and interns doing a roadshow presentation of DesegregateCT stuff, always meetings in the next couple of months about these affordable housing plans. So the idea is we'll have a deeper pool of data and interest of, was that 10% affordability enough in the TOC proposal? That was a blind spot for us. We had a good sort of informal conversation with people. We didn't get the whole AE group to weigh in on it. Some groups just didn't feel comfortable weighing in. They didn't feel like they had the sort of knowledge policy-wise or political-wise, but having a little bit more of that decision-making structure will fortify us a little bit more, I think, going into the legislative session.
Okay, we have 15 minutes left in this session, so if you want to get through your case study at the end, we can do that now and then take questions after that.
Yeah, I'm going to bomb through it very quickly and I'll go back to a quick conversation. I think more interesting for all of us. So one of the things we did, of course, at the local side was actually getting people out in the communities, advocating for transit-oriented communities. So we put together this toolkit based on the AARP walk audits for pedestrian safety around TOCs. We did a couple so far during the legislative session. We're doing more across the state. Berlin, Connecticut was our first choice because they were a town proactively taking advantage. The state opened this Hartford line, as I mentioned, in 2018. They got a new station around a sort of former industrial area in Berlin. So we thought this was a really good standing point to get some media attention to say, it's not just a state mandate, it's towns recognizing there's a huge advantage to doing this kind of development. They got local developers to build some of these projects to get started, so let's go and see what this looks like. Berlin is an essential part of Connecticut. They claim to be the geographical center of Connecticut, just to make it out as it's the case, but I heard that from everybody in Berlin. I don't know, it's demographically similar to Connecticut. It's majority white homeowner, not as wealthy as Fairfield County, but over 6-figure per capita income. And again, this industrial history. There's still a huge steel plant right outside of the transit station in Berlin that they built this station around. I didn't think we could get into the zoning atlas. I just pulled out some data here. So our zoning atlas, this left image, Kensington is the village of Berlin that has this transit station. So that half-mile radius is what's mapped on our atlas. The yellow hash line is public sewer. That's a big part of the infrastructure of what can sort of already now handle multifamily development that's not on septic tanks. So there's a good amount of that in Berlin. Multiple family housing as of right is not allowed at all. That gray is meaning there's nothing as of right, or frankly permanent. And then single family has of right, there are a couple residential sections within that half-mile radius. So that was kind of the area that we were working with so far. The town has done a couple of special layer zoning within the transit district to allow some of this multifamily housing that wouldn't reflect in our zoning atlas because it's just kind of the broad town-wide stuff. So I want to highlight that. We talked about that in our presentation as well. So one of the key things that we did from an outreach standpoint was work very closely with the town. Town planner, town economic development manager. They were really excited to highlight the work that they're doing. Got us in touch with the developers who couldn't make it to the walk audit but were part of the conversation. They actually led part of the conversation in the walk. So that gave us credibility. Again, we're a bit of a controversial organization in Connecticut. But they were doing outreach to the planning and zoning commissioners, town council members. We had a number of those folks come. We had a number of folks that were kind of against development, but knew through the town manager to come out and kind of learn about it. So that was an anchor of the advocacy work we did locally, getting buy-in from the local folks. We kind of put together the walk routes on Google Maps. We basically did it as sort of a 30-minute walk, broke it down into 2 sections. So 30-minute north of the station with a predominantly single-family neighborhood. So industrial area, a 30-minute walk through like a broader single-family large lot residential community. There's a little bit of commercial space kind of right by the station. So we walked through. We had a number of attendees from people on our mailing list that are excited about the work that we're doing, other commissioners from other towns that are interested in what's going on in Berlin. a lot of folks just in the town that are like coming out to these events. Middle of February, cold as all hell, we've got a ton of people out. We're gonna do more of these events, and I think we've already got 50 people signed up for one in Fairfield County we're doing. But that was great. We got people excited to come out and do it in person. It's COVID, it's an outdoor, it's a safe environment to do it. People want to get out and do these kinds of things. We did it during the day on a Wednesday, which was safer time and light-wise. Generally, in the summer, we'll do it on the weekends. And we walked through, we trained everybody, here's the idea of what we're doing, here's this Pro-Homes agenda, what is the transit-oriented community, why it's beneficial to existing residents and future residents of all ages, sizes, and demographics. Walked around highlighting different use cases of what kind of land is there. They had some kind of light industrial area that are undeveloped, being redevelopment. They've got a couple of industrial mixed brownfield sites that get some state funding to do some infill developments. Obviously very complicated financing, but these are things in the works. There's more infrastructure coming, money-wise, obviously. We had some of the folks from the Department of Transportation in Connecticut come. We're always interested in the kind of work that we're doing, just building a dialogue at the agency level of where are there gaps in pedestrian crossings, financing can get streamlined on these things. So we got a great buy-in from some of these different coalition members, different stakeholders within the community and statewide. Talked about the classic pedestrian side of things, bike lane side of things. A couple state roads don't have sidewalks or pedestrian crossings, etc. Talked about some different land use cases and opportunities for multifamily, and also talked about a couple of these developments that are being developed within Berlin right now. This is mixed use apartment, second and third story, retail, first floor. I think they've already leased commercial. They'll look up the residential pretty quickly. This is literally the transit stations right behind this development. So again, we wanted to highlight the fact that this is not some radical new thing. This is something already towns are taking advantage of in Connecticut. If we streamline this and force some towns that don't want to do this, there's still ways to do this at a scale that's appropriate, that's not overwhelming, it's not skyscrapers. Again, that's probably 45 homes per acre in total. So again, we think just having concrete examples of this was a really beneficial side of things. Virginia has a lot more TOCs, particularly in Arlington and Fairfax County, that we've actually highlighted oftentimes. That's a much denser profile than a lot of places in Connecticut, but we show the benefit to development for both jobs and housing that comes from this kind of work, but particularly having those examples in Connecticut are really advantageous. If folks are interested, I think there's a developer audience here, being part of this conversation is really important. Everything is political, so developers have to show up for these kinds of meetings. Sometimes you get developers in Connecticut that show up with stuff that are like, well, if you don't approve this, I'm going to come back with 830G, and I'm going to build more affordable housing and shove it up your butts. That's not totally helpful. It's kind of awesome, but maybe not totally helpful. So building up some dialogue and conversations about this is really important on the developer, whether it's private or nonprofit developers. They were, again, couldn't make it to the walk audit in this particular use case, but they've done it in some others. And one of the other TOC walk audits we did, a town predominantly single-family housing, huge hostility towards TOCs. The Planning and Zoning Commission wanted to do this, but had some resistance to it. Same profile, we came out, we had town officials come, they changed their mind and actually advocated for our state-level policy based on that walk audit. So that was a successful use case of showing, here's the opportunities, here's the residents that need housing right now in your communities, here's the future residents that want to come back, and getting them out of these walk audits is a really great way to do that. Follow-up calls to action is really important, whether it's the state level work that we're doing, getting folks to testify for that, but predominantly actually just going to P&Zs locally and saying, hey, we did this walk audit, why don't we have a transit-oriented district, why don't we even wait for the state to do this? Let's do that. In West Hartford, Connecticut, we've got that in the works right now. There's a big TOC district hearing coming up on June 14th. Then we're going to do a walk audit around and get some support out for that, talk about getting local champions out. I think that's going to pass, so that's another momentum in our direction for this kind of local effort as well. But that's effectively it on that side of it. So I want to jump back to questions, whether it's the case study or otherwise. I see your hand up, sir.
Yeah, we got about 7 minutes.
Okay.
I've been just pondering how analogous this is in Virginia, and outside of Arlington, if you look in Northern Virginia, our metro areas suffer from the force of the county and the city. And I'm just trying to just figure out, like, is a statewide mandate, would that apply the same way here with that divorce of those two groups? And so just give me any thoughts on that, and if you had any situations in Connecticut where maybe a city, county, different stakeholders had equal voices that were offset the same site.
Yeah, I mean, and I thought about it a lot too as I was putting the presentation together of, you know, obviously Northern Virginia has some of this work already, can be doing better than most places. But the reason I focus on the TOC for this, let alone because it's the priority that we did, we have sort of the most case study, but it goes back to what I said earlier, like the political project within this is making the case for state level action, normalizing state level action, building up stakeholders for that. In the case of Connecticut, the TOC start was a really good place to do that. It's like, even accessory dwelling units, the way we got the law passed at the state level was an escape valve was in the law that towns could opt out of that accessory dwelling unit mandate. It sucks that that existed. What's happened in reality is most towns that have opted out have updated their accessory dwelling units to coincide with the state. So policy-wise, there are more accessory dwelling units in Connecticut because of the state law, which is great. As a political project, it was a defeat because we still didn't get the argument for why state level action is needed. So it might not be analogous in Virginia. One of the things for TOC, we talked about fixed transit stations and not local bus stations. That's something we might come back with as well. That might be more applicable in Virginia as well. I know we were talking before, independent cities and counties. Connecticut doesn't have county governments at all. There's just a total anathema to any kind of regional planning. Even in Fairfield County, there are 7 transit districts in just these small towns. And it's crazy because they have terrible service anyway. It's mostly for elderly bus services outside of the cities. But even that is really hard. So that could be an opportunity, that could be an analyst with Virginia, just any kind of bus service, building the case. But what I challenge you more so is what is a good issue to get statewide level? Maybe it's ADUs, going back to Alita. I don't know what the laws are in Virginia for accessory dwelling units, but finding that issue that is salient, that gets local champions excited about what this could mean for the community, but making the case for the state level is a necessary part of this. We have to build the case that there has to be state level action, has to be federal action. In Connecticut, we think the TOC is the best way to do that for various reasons. Obviously, it didn't happen this session, but that's just the beginning for that conversation. So I don't know what that would be in Virginia. I don't know, the accessory dwelling units is what we started for that, literally in the backyard, making that a kind of state mandate with limited success. So that's that. In terms of stakeholders, Connecticut has councils of, councils of governments, like regional councils of governments, or almost like almost a lobbyist group for towns in the regional area. Some of them are amazing and do really good work. They've been working on these affordable housing plans with smaller communities. The one, naturally, in Fairfield County, is an absolute villain. They talk about defending subdivisions and huge on-street parking things, all kinds of bad things. It's unfortunate the guy, I hate to call the guy that, the guy's named Francis, which is my son's name, and it drives me crazy. I almost made me change my decision to have I had to talk to my wife about it. So even in the Council of Governments, some are awesome and really smart, best practices, try to help give some capacity to towns to think about this kind of regionally, very much on the volunteer side. But yeah, there's a concern about that. Again, even some of these state legislators that in theory should be working at the state level are also, town council members and just say, well, we should do things locally. It's why do you run for state office then? And the other big thing I didn't mention too much about, the Connecticut Governor, Ed Lamont, is not a huge pro-homes advocate. He's from Greenwich, Connecticut. He's a very wealthy guy. A lot of his friends get in his ears about this stuff. So he mostly doesn't want to get involved in the issue at all, which is really what paused us here in an election year when there is a concern about the backlash for some of these issues. I think he supported TOCs, the broad side of it, and kind of quietly on the agency side, the TOC and otherwise worked on this work. So I think after the election year, presumably he wins, which I guess I have to root for in this context. We'll probably have some work on that, but the governor is a powerful position in Connecticut that we just don't have on our side of it.
Hey there, real quick, It sounds like you guys have a lot of diversity in terms of like across rural, urban, and suburban regions, and like some young folks and folks of color, like a big diverse grouping of folks who actually came to the B and C conversations, or at least to speak on the bill and offer their thoughts. My question was about access. You mentioned something about these used to be over Zoom, and we're looking more, let's see, towards like in-person meetings. Are we trying to kind of enable those towards like different times of day to account for folks who are working, I guess, more unorthodox working hours? Are there like translators? Is it in an ADA accessible place? Like, I'm just curious about access and kind of the equity piece of people bringing their voices to the table and advocating for this in their communities.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a great question, and that's why I don't know, again, it's contentious in our coalition. I'm a firm believer we can improve local input conversation, get more people using technology, using different types of methods for getting feedback. So I think that's a huge part of it. There was a bill in the state level to expand at least a hybrid model of in-person meetings versus online meetings. Connecticut has this old school Yankee town meeting mentality, like you still need a town meeting to pass the budget, you get like 9% of people come and vote for it. So there's a lot of pushback on that. The anti-homes crowd knows that the less people come to these meetings at the state level or local level, the better. Sometimes lobbyists in these groups also want these kinds of things. So there's a pretty good contingent of people that want to go back pre-COVID, where you have to show up to testify at a state hearing in the Capitol, or show up at PNC meeting on Monday night in the basement. We're working with other groups to try to get the hybrid model at least in place, to have like resources for towns, to be able to put stuff on Zoom, to have translation services. My ideal would be asynchronous voting and review processes, that you've got the meeting, you have whatever is going to be reviewed. I mean, obviously we want more asset-light development in general, but you have a window of time that you can review things, submit comments to it. That's not, if you showed up, even if you're on Zoom, you still have to show up between 9 o'clock, 7 o'clock and 9 o'clock to talk about this. Like, it's just not representative, it never will be. So there's some efforts to try to get that in place. Generational, certainly on that, but we're not quite there where that's been like a legislative priority for our group, let alone otherwise. It's a big do for me, personally, to try to get that. So, yeah, I mean, even our website is not language accessible right now. There's a general, the 15% of the Hispanic population is a great organizing opportunity for us. A lot of the unions members, a lot of these folks, so we're trying to do a little bit more of that. Some of the grant funding we get from local community foundations in Connecticut, I'm carving some of that out to try to get that up as well. So we've got to do better on that, just organizationally on our standpoint, but it's absolutely just politically an urgent thing for us because we need more representation, more voices. I'm just a firm believer, more of us are pro-homes than not. We get those folks in the room, or online or whatever, good things will happen. So it's still an early days process for that.
We are at lunchtime. Do you have time to stick around in the room for a few minutes just in case
Yeah,
folks have questions offline?
Sure.
Great, thank you. So thank you, Pete. Let's give him a break. And awesome suggestions to digest. Lunch will be out in the foyer. Grab a staff person if you have any questions about that. Pete, any final words for the crowd?
Start adopting pro-homes. Start calling people anti-homes who are anti-homes. Start calling people who are pro-homes pro-homes. That's my takeaway.
Thank you all. We have the AIA sign-up sheet if anybody needs to